Beg your pardon? Meredith, who is this coarse person with the foreign accent?
We want our independence. This is what you promised. Our cause has nothing to do with Islamic fundamentalism, and it's solely about national liberation. They estimate that anywhere from at least 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs between the ages of 18 to 30 are being killed every single year, specifically for organ harvesting. The ongoing genocide right now, China's euphemism for it is a strike hard campaign against violent terrorism. That's the official euphemism that it uses, and it's still ongoing.
Hello, I'm Danny, and this is Sylvia.
Yo.
Apparently, in the beginning of these things, I meant to say follow, subscribe, share, do the internet buttons, all the stuff. I'm not doing that enough, they say. So follow, subscribe. Oh yeah, I mean, the name of the show would probably help, right?
Yeah, what shall we subscribe? In the beginning, there was.
This is the Talking Ass.
There you are.
Follow,
There.
okay? And enjoy the show. Hey, welcome. Normally I introduce the guest, but this time I want to hear the correct pronunciation of all the words that we have here, because even your people, I haven't actually heard it pronounced by someone who knows what they're actually called. So you're our first ever minister, so go ahead, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Salih Hudayar. I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the East Turkestan government in exile. I'm an ethnic Uyghur. You might have heard Uyghur being pronounced as Uyghur in the West. So in the Western media, they generally on TV and radios, they refer to us as Uyghurs, but we are actually, the correct pronunciation is Uyghur.
Uyghur.
Yep.
I got it. Yeah, I'm a natural. Fantastic. Hey, East Turkestan government in exile, right? How
Yes.
did you get that job, and what does that mean? You're in exile.
Yes. So I guess first we have to start explaining what East Turkestan is. I think that would be a good way of entering into how I got into this role. So East Turkestan is a Turkic nation, historically independent. Native peoples are Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic peoples. Since the 5th century, this territory was known as Turkestan, meaning the land of the Turks, referring to the Turkic Khaganate of the time. And over the millennia, we remained known as Turkestan. It was around the 1730s that the differentiation between East and West Turkestan became prominent. This was around the time that the Russian Empire began to invade the western parts of East Turkestan. So this is where the divide of East and West Turkestan came about. Eventually, West Turkestan is actually the present-day countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. They fell under Russian occupation, and East Turkestan historically, was the seat of numerous Indo-European and Turkic kingdoms, empires throughout history, starting from about 3,000 years ago till the modern times. In 1759, the Manchukuo Empire invaded East Turkestan and governed it as a military colony. But during that period between 1759 to 1863, the people of East Turkestan resisted or revolted 42 times, and in 1864 restored their independence as the state of Kashgaria or Yettishehar, and this is when commonly in maps at the time we were labeled as East Turkestan. Unfortunately, in 1877, the Manchukuo Empire invaded again and occupied East Turkestan. And in 1884, they renamed it to Xinjiang, meaning the colony or the new territory in the Chinese language. In the early parts of the 20th century, the East Turkestan independence movement became prominent, And in 1933, we declared independence as the East Turkestan Republic on November 12th, 1933. Unfortunately, due to Soviet intervention, in April of 1934, the first East Turkestan Republic was overthrown. A decade later, on November 12th, 1944, we declared independence again as the East Turkestan Republic.
How does that timeline compare to the other Central Asian nations? Obviously, this area wasn't occupied by the Soviet Union because this is in what is today China, right? But when was Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, these are nearby. When were they kind of independent nations?
So they were independent, really, you could say, up until the 1870s. In fact, 1876, the Russian Empire overthrew the Kokand Khanate, which ruled over much of Western Turkestan. And then the year later, the Qing Empire overthrew the invaded and occupied East Turkestan. So that was a time period. But in the after 1917, during the Russian Civil War, which led to the the Bolsheviks coming to power in 1917, the people of Central Asia, of West Turkestan, they also took that initiative to declare their independence. And in 1918, they established the Turkestan Autonomy or Turkestan Republic. In 1920, the Russians invaded, the Soviets at this time invaded again and crushed it. So this was the period. So this is why in 1933, when East Turkestan declared its independence, the Soviet Union viciously opposed it because, again, they felt that if East Turkestan got its independence, then we would serve as a base and support our fellow brothers across the border in getting their independence. So in 1944, we declared independence the second time as the East Turkestan Republic. Initially, the Soviet Union supported us this time, not because really cared about us, but because of it needed access to our uranium reserves, and it saw us as essentially like a buffer against China. However, in 1949, after the Chinese Communists began, defeating the Chinese nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, the Soviet Union Stalin decided that he was going to trade away East Turkestan to Mao, because in 1947, Pakistan and India gained its independence from British rule, but it was still, had heavily British influence. And the Cold War had started. And Stalin was fearful that the United States or Britain would engage with East Turkestan and use it as a point to pressure both the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communists. So he instructed Mao to invade East Turkestan, and then Mao accepted. And after this meeting that took place in July 1949, in August 1949, the leaders of the East Turkestan Republic were called to the Soviet Union for meeting with Soviet officials, and there they were told to merge with the Chinese Communists, and because they refused, they were executed. And then a plane crash was staged on August 27th, 1949, in which the official Chinese and Soviet narrative is that the leaders of the East Turkestan Republic were, flying from Almaty to Beijing to meet with Mao, and their plane crashed over Siberia.
I think we all know about plane crashes in Russia, how they might sometimes not be so accidental, eh?
Yeah. No, in fact, in the 1995 or 96, the former Soviet military intelligence officer who was responsible for Central Asia, he published a book his name is Pavel Sudoplatov. He published a book called Special Tasks. And in that book, he highlighted that one of the tasks that he was given was to, ensure the execution and the plane crash was set up. He said his task was to convince the East Turkestan Republic officials to agree to join with Mao And when they refused, they were tortured, and they still refused. Then they were executed, and then the plane crash was staged as a cover-up. So then in October 1st, the People's Republic of China was declared by Mao, and 11 days later, on October 12th, Chinese Communist forces began invading East Turkestan. And it was on December 22nd, 1949, that they had invaded almost every part of East Turkestan, and that's when they overthrew the independent East Turkestan Republic, and in 1955 designated as an autonomous region, as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
And it's been Chinese, under Chinese occupation ever since, right?
Yeah, and it's been under Chinese occupation ever since. Many of our leaders were actually executed, but those that were lucky enough later, after in 1957, after China gave us the fake autonomy on paper, they rejected the autonomy and said, no, we want to restore our independence as the East Turkestan Republic. And then China began to target all of our leaders as so-called local nationalists. In 1962, there was large-scale protest uprisings, and hundreds of thousands of our people ended up fleeing into the Soviet Union, including many of our leaders. And so the predecessors of our government in exile were actually in the Soviet Union, former military officers and leaders of the East Turkestan Republic that survived. They set up the East Turkestan National Committee because the Soviet Union didn't allow them to officially set up a government in exile, but it was willing to allow us to operate in Kazakhstan as the East Turkestan National Committee to continue advocating for our decolonization and independence. And so this went on up until the fall of the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union fell, China began to freak out because it felt that if it didn't crush us as a people, that we would too push for independence. And the fact is, we did. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of our formerly West Turkestan, now the present Central Asian states, this gave a rise in our independence movement both inside our country, in East Turkestan, and outside the borders, where in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, where we have a diaspora of over 1 million.
So there are Uyghurs right now living in those countries.
Yes.
How many would be there now?
Officially, the governments of those countries state that there's, like in the case of Kazakhstan, they say there's over 300,000 Uyghurs. In Kyrgyzstan, they say there's 80,000 to 100,000 Uyghurs. In Uzbekistan, similar amount. But unofficially, we estimate, because these governments kind of tend to downplay our population size, we believe that there's at least 1 million or more Uyghurs in those countries.
Okay, that's a significant diaspora, but it's not massive. And how many live right now in the actual territory under Chinese occupation?
So that's another. The true population is contested. So the Chinese government claims that our population of Uyghurs in East Turkestan is about 12 million, 12.5 million as of 2020. However, this doesn't align with historical facts prior to the Chinese occupation. For example, in 1946, the United States had a consulate in East Turkestan. Our government at the time, we stated that our population was at least 7 million at that time. The Soviet Comintern, or the Communist International, they stated our population was between 10 to 15 million. In 1949, after Mao took over East Turkestan, in a radio broadcast, he stated that there was 9 million Turkic peoples living in East Turkestan. This includes Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples. So there's no way that, over the course of 70 plus years that you go from, 9 million to only, 12 million over the course of 70 plus years.
Well, there's one way, which is that the Chinese have been killing all of them. I guess.
Yes, there's still that, but we still had a large population growth. Like, We had more births than, the average Uyghur family was like 4 or 5 children. In fact, this is why China launched, forced abortions and population control policies. And China also kind of gave away the true population of East Turkestan's native people, the Turkic population, in its own reporting. So in 2018, Chinese state media highlighted that the Chinese government had collected the DNA samples, voice prints, and retina scans of 36 million non-Chinese peoples in East Turkestan, or what they call Xinjiang, between the ages of 12 and 65. So that ultimately gave away the true population. So there's, we estimate that around that time, our population might have been around 40 to maximum 45 million, somewhere around there.
I'll let you get back to the timeline in a second. I just had a comment about those figures. Is, when people always mention like the largest stateless populations in the world, and the Kurdish people come up, and then the Palestinians, but this is a fairly large population that also doesn't have its own nation state, right?
Yes, and that's precisely actually why China is underplaying our population number, because again, it gives us the title of these are just an ethnic minority, and that's a political tool or a political term used by regimes to essentially delegitimize or deny the right to self-determination of a people. They're just a small minority, even though in East Turkestan we still are the majority at this day, and we were historically the majority. For example, in 1949, shortly after Mao declared that occupied East Turkestan, 95% of the population was Turkic, with Uyghurs coming up around 85 to almost 90% of the population, the demographics. The Chinese made up less than 2 to 3%, and that 2 to 3% was the 200,000 Chinese troops and about 100,000 Chinese civil servants and their families that they had sent to essentially administer East Turkestan. So today, if you look at if you take China's official data as the truth, the Chinese colonists have grown from less than 2 to 3% to over 40% as of 2020. The Uyghurs have gone from over 85% to less than 46% as of 2020, and the combined Turkic population has went from over 95% to about 58% as of 2020. So there has been systematic colonization.
I want you to get back to that history in a second as well, because we're all sufficiently shamed here, because I didn't know any of that, and I'm sure there's more coming that I and the listeners know nothing about. But another comment I had is this issue doesn't get much attention, and have you thought that part of the reason is that you have the Uyghur people, and I still can't pronounce it correctly, but I'll get there. You have the people, and then you have East Turkestan, which is the area. Why not give the area maybe the same name, like Uyghuria or something like that, and then advocate for the independence of it? You see what I mean? Like PR-wise, it's quite difficult for people to maybe figure out what the connection is between these two names.
Well, so actually, the reason we are known as Turkestan or East Turkestan is the fact that, it's not just Uyghurs that live in East Turkestan. Uyghurs are definitely the majority, but there are ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tatars. Furthermore, the Uyghur term was applied to us by the Soviet Union. It was essentially, you could say, created as part of the Soviet Union's divide and conquer strategy. And so they revived the term Uyghur and designated the sedentary Turkic peoples in East Turkestan as Uyghurs, starting after the Tashkent conference in 1924, I believe. So prior to that, if you look at historical records, we were referred as either Turkeys or East Eastern Turkey. Our language was Eastern Turkey, and we were referred as Turks or Turkish. And Uyghur, like, so when we declared independence in 1933 as the East Turkestan Republic, the term Uyghur had not become dominant in East Turkestan. In fact, it was after the first East Turkestan Republic was overthrown that the Soviets, that they implemented and installed a Chinese warlord known as Ching Sai into power in 1934. That's when they began to designate the sedentary Turkic peoples as Uyghurs. So if you look at historical maps, it's East Turkestan or Turkestan. It's about that political and historical continuity that our ancestors or forefathers referred to our country as East Turkestan. Even in 1944, it was the same thing, the East Turkestan Republic, not, as you mentioned, Uyghuria or something else. Because East Turkestan is more than just Uyghurs, and the term Uyghur was actually, revived and applied by the Soviets as part of their,
Yes, understood. So eventually, it might seem far away now, but let's say there will be an independent East Turkestan. Will it be like a pluralistic, maybe even democratic state? Is that the goal? So, because you said, yeah, so all peoples in that region will be welcome to be citizens.
Exactly. I mean, that's how our previous government were. That's why, we wanted something inclusive of all of the Turkic peoples, the native population. And East Turkestan was, we were already referred as East Turkestan in a geographic sense. And so we're like, let's make this political as well, because we're all Eastern Turkic. We're all Eastern Turks. So this is why it's known as the Eastern Turkestan Republic. And our government in the 1930s and 1940s, I mean, it was very pluralistic. We had religious freedom for, all different religions. We had, people from all different ethnic groups in our government, including, Mongols, who are not native to East Turkestan, but there's a sizable Mongol population there. Even they were included in our government and military, because that was the way we can't kick them out. So like, let's just incorporate them into our nation, since we have some historical connections and ties, similarities. Let's work, let's unify our people, all of these different people, as one, nation.
Okay. So, we got to the late 40s, early 50s. The Chinese take over more or less. Can you give us just quickly so how does the repression or the persecution of the people get worse over the decades? What happens, let's say, until you're born? I'm going to guess sometime in the 90s. What happens in those 3 decades under Mao and then later the Communist Party?
So the first thing they do is they start from 1949 to 1953. Our people actually did resist, and this is shown by historical facts. Even the Chinese don't deny that they faced resistance. In fact, Chinese media reports from that time stated that they, by the beginning of 1954, they eliminated 150,000 so-called enemies of China and counter-revolutionary forces that they came across in East Turkestan. So in the first 4 or 5 years, over 150,000 of our people were killed. Then in 1954, Mao sets up the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. So we'll come into this later, because the XPCC plays a very big role in the ongoing genocide. But Mao set it up specifically as a paramilitary force. You could say, if you know anything about the Dutch East India Company, how it was like essentially its own private army, private everything, you could say it's like that. So essentially now it's a paramilitary force. Their primary tasks were to colonize East Turkestan and to suppress, dissent. So after the XPCC was set up, our leaders that survived, they were like, hey, what the heck is going on? You had promised that you were going to withdraw within 3 to 5 years after helping us build a so-called socialist society. We can do that on our own. We want our independence. This is what you promised, that you were just going to help us defeat the so-called foreign imperialists, etc., etc., even though the only foreign imperialists here is the Chinese themselves. So what they did is Mao is like, okay, well, we'll give you autonomy. So they give us puppet autonomy or fake autonomy on paper as the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And that being said, because the Chinese are the minority at that time, a very small minority, and because we are still the majority, we did have some, limited autonomy in that sense. In like many of the leadership was still our people, even though the Communist Party secretariat was always the Chinese. The autonomous regions leadership were, senior officials, were still our people. So this phase went on. In 1962, as I said, hundreds of thousands of people fled into the Soviet Union. And there was, in the 1960s, there was, small scale armed resistance, but nothing, large scale. And in the 70s, again, there was large scale demonstrations, protests, some small scale armed uprisings. And it wasn't until the 80s that China began to label us as separatists. Prior to that, we were local nationalists, counter-revolutionary forces, etc. Then in the 80s, China began to label us as separatists. Again, all of this is being done to deny our right to national self-determination and decolonization in accordance to, established international principles. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, this is when things began to get dark, more expansive. Yes, Chinese colonization was growing. By 1990, the Chinese colonists had grown to over 30%. We were reduced to less than 65% of the population. So this was still ongoing. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, and when our independence movement was slowly becoming, recognized, or slowly becoming internationalized, not fully, but, news reports would talk about our issue, the fact that Uyghurs were fighting for their independence. In 1996, the Chinese Politburo Central Committee, so the top 7 leaders of China, they held a top secret meeting in March of 1996 and issued a top secret document urging, the relevant Chinese Communist Party departments and intelligence agencies, defense ministry, etc., foreign ministry, all to work together to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem, including, using all means necessary, including infiltrating and dividing our diaspora communities, working with the Central Asian government and Turkey, winning them over to, pressuring them to suppress and our independence movement in the diaspora. And it initiated the first Strike Hard campaign a month later. And so even right now, the ongoing genocide right now, China's euphemism for it is a Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism. That's the official euphemism that it uses, and it's still ongoing. So in the 90s, after 1996, as part of the Strike Hard campaign, they arrested tens of thousands of people. At that time, they called it national separatism because it was only after 9/11 that they would start using the label terrorism. So until 9/11, China claimed that it was fighting against national separatism. Over 100,000 of our people were arrested. And this is where my story ends up. How I get involved is my first encounter with the Chinese, occupation forces was in 1997, late 1997, when they raided our home because one of my uncles apparently was reported by someone of reading an illegal, book, a separatist book, a book about our history. So they raided our home in the middle of the night, and they pointed their, when I mean the Chinese PLA, because I'm from the town of Atush, they have a little military base there. They raided our home, and They pointed a gun to everyone's head, their rifles to everyone's head, and threatened to kill us if my uncle didn't, confess to his crime. So that was my first encounter.
What happened to your uncle?
Oh, well, he ended up, being imprisoned for about like 10 years, received a 10-year sentence because of the book that they alleged that he read.
You'll always know that something's really fucked up in a society when they imprison people for reading books.
Yeah. And so my father actually had fled in 1995 after a demonstration. And when they began the crackdown, he fled into neighboring Central Asia, into Kyrgyzstan. And so I really didn't know my father until I came to the United States. But by 1998, China had essentially crushed our independence movement in Central Asia. So my father, after even the Central Asian countries began deporting our people, many of our national leaders, they were assassinated by Chinese intelligence operatives in those countries. And those countries banned any advocacy, even about East Turkestan. So our people can't even in Central Asia, they can't even engage in demonstrations or protests or anything like that, or advocate for East Turkestan from there. So our leaders, surviving leaders, many of them started fleeing to Europe. Some ended up in the United States, like my father, who came in 1998. And so in 2001, after 9/11 happens, China immediately claims that it's a victim of terrorism, and that it's fighting against global jihadists, etc.
Wait, one second. Stop there for a moment. I know this might be a tough question since you hold political office, but what percentage of that is true? Because it's a continuation of the same mountains, basically, from Afghanistan to all the way there. I mean, is there any truth to their claims? Were there back then, if we were fighting jihadists, were any of them escaping or like seeking refuge in East Turkestan or not?
No, no, no. It was the other way around. No one was seeking refuge in East Turkestan. In fact, if you look after, so we'll come back to this. We'll have to come back to 1997 again, 1996 again to explain the game that China played. So in document number 7, after that was issued, the Communist Party chairman in East Turkestan at the time, he issued a statement saying that everything is possible and necessary. All means must be used to suppress the East Turkestan forces, our independence movement, including propaganda, killing. So one of the things that they did is, at that time, our independence movement is slowly gaining traction in the West. Governments, we have, governments and parliaments referring to us as East Turkestan, as they historically did. Resolutions that are being implemented, governments are speaking out against, Western governments are speaking out against China's atrocities. And our independence movement, which is based out of, Kazakhstan at the time. So our leader at that time, Yusupbek Mukhlisi, the leader of the United Revolutionary Front of East Turkestan, he made it very clear that our cause has nothing to do with Islamic fundamentalism, and it's solely about national liberation. And that, we have no problems with any countries or any other nations. Our sole problem is with China. But what China does is, while the strike hard campaign against national separatism is going, as the Chinese call it, over like 100,000 people were arrested during that time. However, a handful of people are, let out to Pakistan. China allows a dozen or so, probably less, Uyghurs into Pakistan, which is China's all-weather ally. And there they are greeted by the Pakistan Islamic Party. This is September of 1997. They're greeted by the Pakistan Islamic Party, and these folks, which many of our people, including our leaders at the time, suspected were Chinese intelligence operatives, even though they're Uyghurs, they declared themselves as the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Party, and said that, God is not going to ask what you do for East Turkestan. God is going to ask what you did for Islam, and that nationalism is forbidden in our language. And, we should be focused on liberating the entire world from global infidels. That's the term he used, Hassan Mahsum. And they denounced our actual leaders, our legitimate leaders, as, Western, infidel-backed Democrats. That's the term that they used.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and so this was the starting phase. They kept, and then in 1998, they sent him into Afghanistan alongside, the Taliban. And after, our independence movement was crushed in Central Asia, especially after 2001, after 9/11, China immediately claims, we're fighting against Islamic terrorism. We're fighting against the East Turkestan Islamic movement. This is the first mention of a so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement was on November 11th, 2001, 2 months after 9/11 at the UN Security Council by China.
Of course, it's a clever move by them. We'll give them credit for that. It made sense at the time and probably still makes sense today to marginalize the struggle of these people and sort of lump it in with the global war on terror.
Yeah, essentially to demonize and undermine our entire movement. And they've been pretty successful in doing that, because the only time where you hear mention of East Turkestan, after 2001 was in reference to the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is in fact, the East Turkestan Islamic Party, which we believe is a Chinese intelligence false flag entity. So that happens, and in 2004, our independence movement across the world is slowly, gradually suppressed across the world, to where in 2002, a Chinese internal document stated that the East Turkestan problem will be resolved within 2 years. And so we have to come back again to document number 7, because Directive 8 in document number 7 of 1996 specifically states, engage in dialogue with overseas groups, meaning our diaspora groups, win over most of them to China's side, marginalize and eliminate and fight against the remaining small numbers, meaning those who refuse to give up independence. Use broad and deep, connections to limit their activities, and use all means necessary to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem. So by 2004, even in our diaspora, even in the West, you're seeing this split to where our movement goes from everyone's asking for independence to, by 2004, some groups are like, we want autonomy. We can't say even the word East Turkestan, or else they'll say we're terrorists. We should ask for, human rights and autonomy under China, even though we already seen what human rights and autonomy has been under China for the past 70 years. So our national leaders, our independence leaders, were able to get the U.S. to tacitly allow us to set up our government in exile in Washington in 2004, in September 2004, to keep our independence movement alive and to advocate for East Turkestan's decolonization and independence on the international stage. So government in exile has been around since 2004.
Wait, so when did your family escape, or when did you leave?
So my father escaped to the U.S., came to the U.S. as a political refugee in 1998. And then in 2000, in June of 2000, with help of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, we were able to reunite with him into the U.S. under political asylum in June of 2000. So I've been in the United States since I was 7 years old. I grew up in Oklahoma.
How many people thought you were Mexican in Oklahoma?
A lot.
Most of them, huh?
Yeah, I'd say 95% with that thought I was Latino.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much here, man. Yeah, I'm ashamed that most of us don't know any of this.
I mean, it's not I mean, the reason Tibet is still Tibet is because one, they have a Dalai Lama. Their cause is more known in that sense. We don't have a Dalai Lama figure. Secondly, they had, countries like India and others essentially lobbying for them, on the international stage, whereas we had no country willing to actually help us. So one of the things that China did was one of the things that they asked is you're not going to the U.S. side was that you're not going to utter even the term East Turkestan. You're just going to use the term Xinjiang, and so that following the 1970s, that became more dominant in the official terminology, you could say. So
Yeah.
if you Google Xinjiang, you'll see it as that, but as East Turkestan, you'll have to look at maps prior to, prior to 1949, 1950s. The precursor to the ongoing genocide was actually in the early 2000s, in 2009, you could say. So the reason YouTube became banned in China was because in 2009, in June of 2009, when the Chinese forcibly relocated thousands of Uyghurs to Chinese provinces, young Uyghurs, as essentially forced labor to dilute them, in a Chinese-centric environment. Many of the Uyghurs there were attacked by, the Chinese because they're not being paid. The Chinese that are being paid are being laid off, where the Uyghurs that are being given minimum payment, barely anything. The Chinese that were laid off got angry, and so they spread rumors that, Uyghurs are harassing our women or that they're taking our jobs. And so a large mob attacked this toy factory where the Uyghurs were working. Hundreds of Uyghurs were working there. And they uploaded those videos of them attacking the Chinese mobs. Like, we're talking about thousands of Chinese people armed with clubs and spikes. And in those videos, they stated that, you can see, it's still available on YouTube. You can see a couple that he killed 20 Uyghurs by himself. These are the Chinese that are uploading this, not us. Another one says, I killed almost a dozen. And so after these videos were uploaded, our people saw them in East Turkestan. And so they took to the streets to protest, demanding, justice, and, the fair treatment under the so-called Chinese constitution that we're supposed to receive. And what the Chinese government did is it brutally suppressed the demonstrations. It became known as the Urumqi massacre. Tens of thousands of Uyghurs were arrested, thousands were killed, and then the Chinese government shut down the internet, everything, communications for an entire year. Dozens of Uyghurs were later executed for leading those demonstrations. And then Chinese national defense strategists, they began, preparing for essentially the invasion of Taiwan. And so they're like, but we have one thing that is preventing us from invading Taiwan, one serious problem. The one problem is the East Turkestan problem. And they say if China was to invade Taiwan, the US could counteract by potentially arming 300,000 to 500,000 Uyghurs overnight and cut off China's west to east pipelines and energy grids. And China would lose that war. So they were like, we have to deal with this problem. But how are we going to deal with this problem? Well, on the international front, we're going to call it counterterrorism. This is what they said. But of course, we know that's not the truth. And then after he states that, he goes into he states, we should actually thank Osama bin Laden for keeping America busy for the past 8 years, giving us the opportunity to develop while America was dragged into that quagmire. Like, this is the level of craziness that the Chinese have. Anyway, so starting in 2010, this is when they start building the camps. So if you look at satellite imagery analysis on Google Earth of the location of the camps, because on Google Earth you can see when they started the excavation, you'll see that they started in 2010, 2011 of the concentration camps. And there's over 1,400 of them in East Turkestan. And then by 2013, Xi Jinping came to power. First thing he does is unveil the Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure and trade project. And China claims it facilitates trade, but it's not just about trade, but it's about controlling key land ports and maritime ports. And guess where Belt and Road goes through?
Well, I'm gonna guess it goes right there through East Turkestan and then it ends in Iran, right? Somewhere.
It ends all the way in Europe, in Eastern Europe.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. But it goes through Iran at some point, right?
Yeah. It goes into Pakistan, into Iran, into Kazakhstan, all of which is impossible without East Turkestan.
I see.
Xi Jinping then launches the ongoing genocide. But before he does that, in 2012, the Syrian conflict breaks out in Syria. So another way you might have heard about Uyghurs is like, oh, aren't there Uyghur jihadists in Syria? So in February 2012, Xi Jinping then is the vice president of China. He visits Turkey, and there it's about on the topic of Syria and trade. This is what they discussed. 2 months later, in April of 2012, Erdogan visits China. And again, if you look at the headlines then, the same thing. They discuss Syria and trade. So what the hell does Syria and trade have to do with China? So this is where things get a little murky. But by 2014, what you notice is by the end of 2013, there's Uyghurs that are ending up in Syria. Turkey is playing the role of rescuing these Uyghurs because by 2010, China had already set up checkpoints all across East Turkestan. You can't go from one city to another without getting a special pass. Yet, 20,000 plus Uyghurs somehow magically, evade dozens of checkpoints, Chinese intelligence and military patrols, surveillance, and end up in Southeast Asia where they are rescued by Turkey and then bust into Syria, where they become cannon fodder for Erdogan's, for the Turkish government against both the Kurds and against the Assad regime.
Yes, and for those who don't know, by the way, Turkey was supporting all kinds of jihadists in that Syrian civil war. And it's a NATO country. We should have a little think about what Turkey's ambitions are in this world, just as a side note. But yeah, you're saying China and Turkey had a little sneaky little operation going on to make the Uyghurs look bad, or?
Yes, I mean, because you got to look at it. You have to be able to justify the mass internment of millions of people, the genocide of a people. You can't just claim it's terrorism without, having some actual evidence, without something to point to. So even today, for example, or yesterday, Turkish foreign minister, who was the head of Turkish intelligence during that period, the current foreign minister Hakan Fidan. If you look on my Twitter, you can see the latest tweet in which I translated his remarks. And he stated that we are going to give them an even more historic opportunity and create a win-win solution. Like, this is what we need to do. Because what Turkey wants to do is it has the Kurdish problem, as you know. And Turkey's own head of Turkey's own National Defense University last year, he stated that Turkey was having a population crisis amongst the ethnic Turkic peoples. While the Kurdish population was rising, the Turkish population was decreasing. And he said, we need to solve this immediately. And he's like, I propose we bring in millions of Uyghurs from China and resettle them here. Turkey and China had entered into a secret agreement to transfer 3 to 5 million Uyghurs to Turkey.
Hey.
Yeah.
Now this is totally new. This is all kinds of fucked up.
Yeah, so because they already tested this in Syria. So using the Uyghurs in Syria, China then began to Chinese intelligence carried out a bunch of false flag attacks, indiscriminate attacks against civilians. And even Western experts who, focused on our issue, those who monitored our issue, they were puzzled. They're like, why the hell are Uyghurs, because China's saying, oh, Uyghurs are committing, terrorism. They're like, why the hell are Uyghurs suddenly going from attacking Chinese military personnel and, infrastructure like pipelines and energy grids to indiscriminate acts of terrorism, especially in light of China claiming that, it's fighting against terrorism. This would just, this doesn't add up here. This is actually working into China's hand. That's the official euphemism that they use. The People's War Against Terrorism, or the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, on May 23rd, 2014. And this begins the genocide. First, they arrest young men between the ages of 15 and 45 on the basis that they're prone to become radicalized. And by 2016, after 200,000 or so men have been arrested, not a single peep from the international community. Because again, what is China saying? I'm fighting against terrorism. So the international communities are like, okay, they just turn a blind eye. And then by 2016, they start interning the entire population. Men, women, old, young, separating children from their families. The Chinese government's own 2020 white paper stated that between 2014 to the end of 2019, they sent 1.29 million people per year, or roughly 7.8 million people, almost 8 million people, to so-called vocational training and re-education. That's the official euphemism for its concentration
So that's
camp.
these camps. I was going to ask whether there's any estimate of how many people might have been through these camps, but so it's millions and millions,
Yeah.
right? Do people come out of them? Are these like, what are we talking? What's known about them? Does anyone make it through, or do people eventually just die there?
So it's a bit of both. In most cases, a lot of people that have been into these camps, they're never heard of again. But after 2019, 2020, there was a lot of international pressure and awareness. So China claimed that the people in these camps graduated, and those that graduated were given jobs and have been transferred to factories to work. 3.5 million people. That's what they said. This is again the Chinese government's own statement, that they provided 3.5 million people with jobs. Of course, it's forced labor, slave labor. Our people are being killed through various means, from torture to executions to massacres. They've engaged in ethnic cleansing campaigns in remote villages. This has been testified by former Chinese soldiers that later escaped or later fled to either Europe or other places. In fact, on Chinese social media itself, you had Chinese soldiers gloating about how they, engaged in ethnic cleansing campaigns when they were stationed in so-called Xinjiang in East Turkestan.
I think I've seen some of that video sometime. I don't know, this issue. Like a few years ago, it did come on my radar for a bit, and I think there were, videos of Chinese soldiers saying all kinds of fucked up shit. It's very bad that none of us know about this, by the way. Are they doing cultural erasing as well? That's usually a sign of a serious sort of genocidal intent, is erasing language, mosques, all that stuff.
Yeah, so what they started with is like after 9/11, immediately prior to that, we still had the teaching of our language in schools. We could still learn our language. In 2003, China launched the so-called bilingual program. On paper, it's bilingual. In reality, it's monolingual, Chinese. They claim that it's bilingual because they're like, oh, after they finish high school, they have the opportunity to learn Uyghur in college. So this was when they started targeting our language. Then by 2010, they began, after the Urumqi massacre, after they installed hundreds of millions of security cameras everywhere and over like 50,000 or more police checkpoints everywhere across East Turkestan, they began to target our religion, again, under the framework that people are being extremists, separatists, etc. And then they targeted our entire culture. So thousands of mosques, over 16,000 mosques, and other cultural sites have been destroyed across East Turkestan, with many of them being turned into public toilets, pigsties as a sign of humiliation, all of these types of things. And in fact, they also began to take over 1 million of our children away from their families because, what they realized is that the so-called bilingual program was not working as effectively as they wanted because even if they teach you Chinese all day, that's all you learn at school. At the end of the day, what are you going to do? At the end of the school day, you're going to go back home. You're going to engage with your family. You're still going to retain your culture. You're still going to retain some elements of your language, right?
So they split the families from each other. Is that what they did?
Yeah, so they took over 1 million of our children. The official number as of 2019 was 980,000. This is the Chinese government's own data, but we believe by now it's over 1 million from their families. And we're talking about kids as young as 2, 3 years old and putting up in so-called orphanages or boarding schools to become raised as loyal Chinese citizens. That's what the Chinese government's official propaganda is, that we're turning them into loyal Chinese citizens because they've been infected by extremist ideology, separatist ideology, etc., etc.
Yeah. What about sterilization, birth prevention, things like that? Demographic engineering, I guess.
Yeah, so that actually started much earlier. In 1980s, in 1989 is when they started launching the forced birth control and forced abortion policies in East Turkestan because they were afraid, as our population, because we have a lot of babies, as our population is growing, the Soviet Union is, splintering. They're afraid that we will rise up. So they need to prevent that from happening. So what is one way of effectively preventing the future of a nation? Preventing them from having kids. So according to Chinese government data, in 2009, they stated that between 1989 to 2009, they had prevented 3.7 million illegal births among so-called ethnic minorities, meaning those that are not Chinese, in the so-called autonomous region in East Turkestan. So they aborted 3.7 million of our babies in a 30-year period.
It's pretty fucking heavy, man. Yeah. This is terrible.
And we estimate that since 2009, we estimate at the very least they've aborted at least hundreds of thousands of our babies. As part of the ongoing genocide, they forcibly sterilized over 300,000 women. Again, this is according to Chinese government's official data. We believe it could be much higher, but this is based on the official medical data that they put out. They set up a growth rate quota for our country, and they stated that for our ethnic group, there needs to be a 0% growth rate.
Yeah. I thought that I had here, maybe this is important for some listeners to think, is that in the West we hear a lot of people worrying about racism, colonialism, imperialism, those words. This is what it really looks like Han Chinese racism, Chinese imperialism, genocide. This is a place where you can apply those words and be pretty accurate, right?
Yeah.
I don't like some of the stuff that even the British Empire has committed pales in comparison to this. This is like exceptionally ruthless.
Exactly, and their ultimate goal is to completely erase us. I mean, this is not limited just to the living. Like, forget about, our living people, even our deceased, our cemeteries of our ancestors, all of it have been destroyed, flattened, and their bodies cremated. Furthermore, many of these camps in East Turkestan, the concentration camps, many of them have crematoriums there. And we are a predominantly Muslim population, at least 97, 98% Muslim.
You don't cremate your bodies.
Yeah, we don't ever cremate our bodies, but we have more crematoriums in East Turkestan than in any other part of China. In fact, the reason that they're doing this is, one, people are dying in these camps because they're being tortured, They're being beaten. They're dying from either disease, torture, or malnutrition. And then there's organ harvesting. The Chinese government's own data again. We're not using anyone else's data. Let's just look at the Chinese government's own data. They don't call organ harvesting organ harvesting. They call it by a much prettier name, which is organ transplants. That's the term that they use. So in 2013, the number of organ transplants that occurred in China in the whole of the PRC was 6,000. And this is important because 2013 is before they officially launched the ongoing genocide. In 2014, it skyrockets over 50,000 transplants. Again, China claims this is all voluntary. Where are these organs coming from? From those prisoners. Today, it's estimated that even though the Chinese government claims that there's like 80, 90,000, it's estimated that it's at least 100,000 so-called transplants happening, which is organ harvesting. And researchers on China's organ harvesting, experts who research this, like Ethan Gutman, they estimate that anywhere, conservative estimate again, and they testified this before the U.S. Congress, they estimate that anywhere from at least 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs between the ages of 18 to 30 are being killed every single year, specifically for organ harvesting. By 2025, he stated at least a quarter to 500,000 of Uyghurs will have been killed specifically for their organs. And you won't hear this being talked about in the mainstream media because many don't report.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why are you here, man? Like, you should be taught this should be on you should be on the massive platforms. Like, this should be on the news every day.
Yeah, and then it was somewhat getting some media attention and international attention before, Russia invaded Ukraine. In fact, this coming Monday, January 19th, marks the 5th anniversary of the U.S. recognizing it as genocide and crimes against humanity. And you had the parliaments of Canada, even the UK parliament, the parliaments of Belgium, France, the Netherlands, total of like 13 or 14 parliaments, national parliaments, also recognizing it as genocide. You had 51 UN member states issuing a joint statement at the UN condemning China for, at the very least, crimes against humanity. Even the UN High Commission for Human Rights also stated, at the very least, China is committing crimes against humanity, if not full genocide. Yet there has been no accountability whatsoever. Governments, because of other crises that other parts of the world after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, everyone's been muted on our issue. And China has been, waging a propaganda campaign now, inviting select journalists and influencers from across the world, paying for them to come visit East Turkestan and see it from their own eyes. And they take them to two main locations. One is Urumqi, and specifically the International Bazaar, which is like a Pomtican site. And there they have Chinese people, not Uyghurs, because in your eyes, like if you had not seen an Uyghur, you probably read that we're referred to as so-called Chinese Muslims. And do I look Chinese to you?
Well, there's that whole region. I'd say, you dress like maybe something we would have seen an Afghan or something like, or a Tajik dress as, or an Uzbek or something. And then, I mean, the Mongolian genes are strong out there, so the eyes are kind of similar across those countries. I wouldn't say you look distinct from like a ethnic Han Chinese person, I'd say.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, because of the media for the longest time always referring us as Chinese Muslim minorities or Chinese Muslims, there's this illusion that, in the eyes of the Western people who don't know anything about us, these people must be Chinese and they must be, Chinese Muslims. So what does China do in these propaganda campaigns? It dresses up Chinese people in our traditional clothing, in our hats, teaches them a few words in Uyghur, how to say hi, how are you? I'm doing well. And then this is the people that they use at these pumpkin sites because they only bring them to these bazaar areas and saying, look how happy these Uyghurs are. They're singing and dancing. And when the Western influencer or journalist goes there, and this is not like journalists from like BBC or others. It's just like, from other countries who has close ties with China, who, reports on whatever China wants them to report on.
We know all about it, man. We had Theresienstadt here in Europe, which was a Nazi propaganda camp.
Yeah, so this is what they do. They dress up these Chinese people, push them as Uyghurs, and they're singing happy and dancing. And they're saying, "Oh, these are lies. There's no genocide going here. We're happy under China." But for us, we Uyghurs, we know how we look. We know these are Chinese propagandists. These are actually ethnically Chinese people pretending to be Uyghurs. But to those influencers, those that are going there, oh, they think these are the Uyghurs. And another part of the propaganda that the Chinese government has been putting out is that, the ones outside, in our diaspora, those aren't Uyghurs. These are, Turkish and other agents pretending to be Uyghurs. This is the narrative that they're putting out, to hide its atrocities, to hide its genocide. So coming back to how I ended up, I grew up in Oklahoma. In fact, when I first came to the U.S., the very first day after my father picked me up, my older brother, my older sister, my younger sister, and my mother from the airport, he drove us to his apartment. And there, the first thing he did was he's like, I want you guys to remember why I brought you here. I didn't bring you guys here so you could, forget your people, forget our country. I brought you here so y'all can become educated and one day return to free our country. And so since the very first day, our father began teaching us our history, our culture, our true identity. And I wanted to be a military officer. That was my childhood dream, and I wanted to be a general and to one day return as a general to liberate East Turkestan. That was my childhood dream. And so I did ROTC, which is Reserve Officer Training Corps, and I became a member of the Oklahoma Army National Guard to gain some experience before I commissioned as an officer. And unfortunately, while I was at a field training exercise, after returning, I kind of like pigged out at the cafeteria and developed appendicitis. And after an emergency appendectomy, they scanned my body and also discovered I had, polycystic kidney disease. And that, after 2 years, that ended my, military career. I became depressed for about a month or two, and because my military career ended, and I was like, I don't know what to do. Then I decided, I still have another way to help my people. And that's to get involved in policy. And I graduated in the end of 2016, right around when the U.S. elections were happening. But at the same time, we are losing contact with our relatives back home. They're being picked up and thrown into the camps. And so I decided to advocate for my people. I founded an organization called the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, now known as the East Turkestan National Movement, to advocate not just for our human rights, but for our political rights. Because without political rights, there's no guarantee of our human rights, let alone, our existence. And this is a fact that we have been witnessing just from our ongoing experience. By 2018, we were able to get the U.S. Congress to, introduce a bill about our people called the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Then we had also gotten the State Department to start talking about our issue, raising it at the UN. Also grassroots advocacy, reaching out to universities, churches, synagogues, mosques, wherever we could to highlight our plight. As I did that, this is when the government in exile took notice of my work, because I also spearheaded not just our movement here in the U.S., but I also encouraged cooperation with other young Uyghurs across our global diaspora. And we organized similar advocacy and demonstrations and other events across Europe, across Turkey, We tried also in Central Asia, but they quickly shut it down over there. And so the government in exile took notice of my work, and they're like, "We want you to represent us." I don't really know my own people at that time. Like I grew up in Oklahoma, so I'm not well connected with our diaspora in the DC area. All my connections have been through, social media. So I was like, I don't know. If I want to be, member of parliament, I think I'll just stick to being a representative. Then in November, at the 8th General Assembly, they nominated me for the position of prime minister, and I was like, look, I really don't want this, and I hated being in that position, to be honest, because one, it's so much difficulty trying to get various ministers to all work together, and managing the entire government was just very, very difficult, especially in our government exile where our leaders are literally based all across the world. For example, our president is based out of Australia. Our current prime minister is in Canada. Our vice president is in Sweden. It was just very hectic. I ended up getting the most votes, and I served as the PM from November 2019 until November 2023, when I was like, I don't want to, even get involved in a senior position, like demote me back to something that I can, manage. We ended up having a new government leadership. We elected new government leadership, and the new government was like, well, we want to retain you. And so they're like, we want you to be our Minister for Foreign Affairs. And that's the work that I've been doing since November 2023.
Yeah, fascinating, man. What a story. In your lobbying work now in Washington, where would you say the allies are, if anywhere? Who cares about this, the left or the right, or is it anyone?
I mean, it's mixed. To be honest, it's mixed. You can't just say it's the left or the right. It's from both sides, which is a good thing for us. We have allies amongst Democrats like Representative McGovern, who's been a long-time ally for our people, but they're more focused on the human rights aspect. And then we have, those on the Republicans who are also focused on the human rights aspect, but also are more willing to engage in the political and national security aspects. And that's where our issue needs to be as well, because talking about the human rights violations and asking for better human rights conditions have actually clearly failed us over the past 70 plus years or 76 plus years. At this rate, again, as the government in exile has been pointing for decades, China is not going to give us any human rights. It's not going to give us any better, improved situation, no matter what we do. Its ultimate goal is to eradicate us completely and, replace us.
This sounds like the only hope is some kind of intervention. And sorry to make a joke here, but what kind of natural resources are there? Is there any chance of anyone intervening? Because they won't intervene just to save the people. We've learned that.
Yes, well, unfortunately, that is geopolitics. Unfortunately, however, East Turkestan. The reason China is also doing this is, again, we are the cornerstone of their Belt and Road Initiative, but also we are their energy base. East Turkestan is 1,828,418 square kilometers, which is about a fifth of the total areas claimed by the PRC, or that is under the control of the People's Republic of China. That's like 4 times the size of France.
Huge.
More than 4 times the size of France. So it's a huge piece of territory. In the U.S. perspective, it's 2.5 times the size of the U.S. state of Texas. So it's very large. But in terms of energy resources, East Turkestan is home to over 40% of the coal reserves that China claims is theirs. It makes up over 30% of all the oil and natural gas reserves that China claims it has. The electricity from East Turkestan powers over 120 Chinese cities in 15 different Chinese provinces. Our natural gas supplies, we supply 20 different Chinese provinces with natural gas. The largest gold reserves that China claims is again housed in East Turkestan. We have large uranium deposits, tungsten deposits. We have a lot of critical minerals and rare earth minerals. So it's strategically vital economically. Essentially, we are the economic lifeline of the PRC in that sense. Without East Turkestan, there is no Belt and Road Initiative. So it's like not just an economic, but also a geopolitical lifeline for China, for Chinese power. That's why they fear that if they don't wipe us out, or if they don't reduce us to a so-called manageable number, to where they make us into that so-called minority that they have long been propagating us as, in the event of any great power conflict, they're afraid that we will, some other greater powers could, that we work with those powers to.
Yeah. Well, at this point you would, right? I doubt there'd be much loyalty to the Chinese. By the way, what about the region? Is there any sympathy? What are like sympathetic actors across Central Asia, Middle East? Who's on your side, so to speak?
Unfortunately, I can't say that we have any sympathetic actors, in terms of governments or large, multilateral organizations in any part of the world, especially in Central Asia. Yes, the United States, Europe is, sympathetic, but in terms of Central Asia, while the people themselves are deeply, sympathetic with us because we are essentially more or less the same people. The governments, again, since 1997, 1998, have been increasingly cooperating with China. In fact, they've deported a large segments of our population from East Turkestan that recently, came to try to do business in those countries. They deported them and handed them over to the Chinese. All these countries are part of the SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was specifically set up by China for the sole purpose of suppressing our independence movement. What pisses me off the most is that governments like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, it's not just the Uyghurs that are being targeted. China is targeting all ethnically Turkic peoples in East Turkestan, the native peoples of East Turkestan. So you have Kazakhs that are being persecuted in the same way as Uyghurs. You have Kyrgyz that are being imprisoned and tortured and killed. Uzbeks. Yet these governments, who claim to be our brother nations, are turning a blind eye. Again, because of Chinese influence, economic investments, and money that it's pumping into both the pockets of the corrupt officials in those countries, as well as so-called investments in those countries.
This is wild, man. Again, I have to say I'm so ashamed that most of this is so new to me. Can I ask you a tough question? So, let's say you guys, blue sky thinking, something good happens, and let's say way 2 decades into the future, hopefully there are still people left and everyone hasn't been killed or sterilized or so forth, and there is independence of some kind, and you guys get to take over, the ones who've been advocating for the people abroad. What would happen to the Chinese population at that point? Do you think there'll be reconciliation with them, or would it just be genocide going the other way?
No, there's not going to be, it's going to be tough to reconcile, because the Chinese population they're all colonists there. Even the ones in the West, for example, it's not just the ones inside East Turkestan, but even the ones in the West that claim to, be pro democracy, pro human rights, etc. I'll give you several examples. One, when the United States recognized the genocide against our people, the leader of China's democracy movement what the West and others call the leader of China's democracy movement.
An opposition figure.
Yeah, so the Wei Jingshen, he condemned the U.S. for recognizing it. He denied the genocide was happening, and he said that, this is going to embolden the so-called terrorists, referring to us as terrorists, to push for independence.
Well, these are fake opposition movements anyway, right? Like you see it in all authoritarian countries, like Iran has them too, that these so-called democracy movements that are really controlled by
even the leaders of the Chinese Christians here, or those who claim to be, leaders of the Chinese Christians, the same thing. In Canada, when the Canadian Parliament voted to recognize the Uyghur genocide, a Chinese senator who again, he has no actual ties to China itself. He was born in he was born in Singapore, so he has no direct ties to China, but he's ethnically Chinese. And again, he condemned the Canadian Parliament for recognizing the Uyghur genocide. He opposed it and he condemned them, saying that this is a lie and this is, going to disrupt Canada's relationship with China. In France, the very same thing. Again, when the French Parliament voted, a Chinese senator viciously opposed it, again echoing the Chinese propaganda that China is engaging in counterterrorism, this is not genocide, blah, blah, blah. In the Netherlands, 57 Chinese organizations, including many that claim to be pro-human rights, pro-democracy, etc., all issued a joint statement condemning the Dutch Parliament for recognizing the genocide and urging them to issue an apology and undo the recognition.
Yeah. But it's become really clear recently. There's been a lot of reporting on how these Chinese organizations in the West are full of spies. That doesn't surprise me that even so-called critical,
in our diaspora as well. In fact, in our diaspora, there's two main factions, you can say. One is the government in exile and those who align, who want independence. And the other is, the ones that are want cultural and cultural autonomy under Chinese rule, led by the, under the spearhead of the World Uyghur Congress. This past April, the Swedish security services, they arrested the spokesperson for the World Uyghur Congress, and he was one of the co-founders, for espionage on behalf of Chinese intelligence. So it's not just the Chinese organizations, but also our organizations that are deeply infiltrated and influenced by Chinese intelligence. Because again, what does document number 7 state? Win over most of the groups, marginalize and alienate those who refuse to give up on independence, and then use all means to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem. So this is not just them. But now coming back to your question, another example is in 2007, a Chinese scholar, he wrote a book in Chinese called Your East Turkestan, My Western China. And in that he highlighted, he was honest about it. He said what China is doing is colonial. We can call it whatever the hell we can call it. But at the end of the day, what we are doing is colonialism. So don't be surprised if these Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples are against us because of the colonization that we're engaging. He said we're not even willing to engage in a meaningful dialogue with them. He said, from what I witnessed, he said, when I spoke to, and this is in one page of his book, he said, when I spoke to even the most liberal and pro, opening up Chinese officials and intellectuals, as soon as I mentioned the word East Turkestan, the first thing that their mouths foamed with the word kill, kill, kill. And he said, I realized, and he writes this in his book, I realized that if it would take the deaths of millions of Uyghurs to keep, East Turkestan, or what they call Xinjiang, under Chinese rule, all of these people would remain completely silent. And that is the reality. So for us, there's no way to reconcile with, a genocidal regime.
Okay. No, I understand that. That's fair enough, and plus because this is still ongoing and it's getting worse. I mean, they're thinking about conducting nuclear weapons tests there as well, right?
Yeah, no, we're not against reconciliation in principle, but the only way to meaningfully reconcile is one, end the genocide, end the colonial occupation, and pay reparations. Similarly, as how it took decades for Israel and Germany to, reconcile, and Germany ended up paying, a lot of reparations. Similarly, how it took decades for China and Japan to reconcile because of that, brief period in which Japan occupied China. It took decades for them to reconcile, and even Japan was forced to pay billions of dollars in reparations. Furthermore, the Chinese, what they did was they deported all the Japanese, because there was close to 1 million Japanese people that had that were in China after World War II ended. They deported them all back to Japan. They repatriated them because they came illegally. Similarly, in terms of Algeria, Algeria's struggle against the French colonization. They were under French occupation for 139 years. There were millions of French colonists living there. But after Algeria gained its independence, they repatriated the majority of the French colonists back to France. We're not against Chinese people coming back to East Turkestan in the future. If they want to come back as tourists, apply for an East Turkestani visa. If you get approved, you can come in. We're not against that.
What about territory-wise? Would you settle? See, as you said, this is like what, 20% of China. This is a massive, massive region stretching from whatever, Tajikistan to Mongolia, India to Kazakhstan, whichever way you measure it, right? A huge chunk of it is desert. What's the desert called again? Like
Yeah, Taklamakan Desert.
Taklamakan Desert. Huge chunk of it is desert, but still, this is territorially, this is a massive chunk of China, and they're never gonna give that up to.
They're not going to give it up voluntarily. That's for sure. But they're going to be forced to give it up because it's not theirs to begin with.
No, no, I understand that. I mean, but on what time scale? You're saying they might one day be forced to give it up, but what are you saying? Like in centuries from now, when their
No, no.
economy goes.
In centuries, we will, like I'm telling you, if something doesn't happen, this is where I have to raise the alarm. We don't have a whole lot of time. This is a reality. We have a very, very small, limited window of opportunity, maybe the next 10, 15 years to either get our independence or disappear. That's the reality for us. After that, we won't have an opportunity ever again. Like we will cease to exist as a people. You won't even find Uyghurs in 50 years. You won't find any Uyghurs. At most, you'll be like, my grandfather used to be in something called an Uyghur. That's about it. That's what's going to happen to our people at this rate of colonization, at this rate of genocide. And realistically, our issue is not going to be resolved, peacefully. That's the sad reality. If it was going to be resolved peacefully, it would have been resolved by now. What it's going to take is conflict. And again, it's not conflict just with Uyghurs rising up against China. That's not going to work out. Just us solely rising up against China. It's going to involve when China is pulled into a conflict with another greater power, then we can seize that opportunity. So if China doesn't get involved, pitted into a conflict with another greater power, whether it's the United States, whether it's India, or even perhaps Russia over, Chinese expansion into Siberia. If none of that happens, we're finished as a people. That's the sad reality.
Yeah. It's almost like kind of saved by war is the hope. Is that it?
Well, I mean, that's like if you remember the Holocaust, I mean, essentially the Jews were saved only after World War II started. Because it's not that the world didn't know what was happening to the Jews. The governments knew that Nazi Germany was engaging in a Holocaust against Jews and other peoples, but they just didn't have the incentive or the need to act against it because it wasn't really inflicting their own interests in that sense. And this is how governments act. But China, if China finishes East Turkestan off, China is going to expand further west into Central Asia, south into India, north into Siberia, and it's already laying down the logistics for that. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just about trade; it's much more than that. And another alternative to war is that if China implodes internally, in the case of like the Soviet Union, then we might have another opportunity to free ourselves then. But if it doesn't happen again within the next 15 to 20 years, we will never have that opportunity ever again. And that's the sad reality. Our people understand this, but Western governments, the international community is not understanding that, because just solely keeping this issue a Chinese internal affairs matter or a human rights matter, we're concerned. The world has been concerned for the past 70 years. That doesn't change China's objective. All it does is actually help China buy time, because the more that they colonize, the more they can get away with genocide, the faster they reach their goal. And their goal doesn't end with East Turkestan. It only begins with it.
Yeah, man. But I don't really know what to say. Like, I don't exactly want to hope for a world conflagration and a massive superpower war just to save these people. But we do have to do something. Like, this is, I mean, number one, just not even knowing about this. Not even, I did a degree in this stuff, and I didn't even know how big East Turkestan was in the first place. Like, it's just a shame.
Well, for us, I mean, I personally also, I don't hope for a war. We're not out here trying to start a war. I just want to make that very clear. But again, as I said, there's like two or three scenarios in which we can ensure our existence. One is, like, as I mentioned, is conflict. If this conflict happens, whether it's, with the US and China over Taiwan, if China launches its invasion of Taiwan and the US decides to, support us in pressuring China, that's one area. Another scenario is if China decides to invade Siberia. Already, it's engaged in actually a lot of colonialism in Siberia. There's more Chinese in the southern parts of Siberia than Russians, and Russia, it's been turning a blind eye to it because, again, it temporarily needs China for its support against the West. So it's turning a blind eye to that, but they're recognizing that threat as well. There's India, who's worried about China. This is all from the geopolitical side. On the internal front, like China itself, there's a lot of corruption in China. At the same time, the cost of living is increasing. The economy is not doing as well as the Chinese government proclaims it is. A lot of people are, becoming jobless. So there's like an internal situation where you might see the Chinese people themselves, if there's a lot of people going out with jobs, they might themselves turn on the Communist Party, and that might be an opportunity for us. But what the world can do is prepare for all scenarios. And either way, even if China becomes a democracy, if the international community, even if the CCP falls, if the international community doesn't support our right to national self-determination and decolonization, then the CCP will only be replaced by another Chinese regime that will implement the same genocidal policies and colonial policies just under a new hat.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are your concretely speaking though now? What's next for you? What's the next step, and what can other people do?
Well, right now, all we're asking for is for the international community to uphold their obligations to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. Not by, we're not asking any country to go to war against China for us, but, you have international courts like the IC International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. By supporting our complaints before the ICC and introducing similar complaints, because only sovereign states can do that, unfortunately, before the International Court of Justice, we can apply maximum legal pressure on China to at least stop some of its genocidal policies and essentially buy time for our people to survive a little longer until, whatever scenario develops into being, whether it's the CCP falling, or whether it's China turning into democracy, or whether it's China going to war with another power. So these are things that they can do. The international community needs to reaffirm our right to decolonization and self-determination. Similarly, China, for example, China repeatedly invokes the Palestinian people's right to independence and statehood and national self-determination, and even the right to armed resistance by using, international law, UN General Assembly resolutions and international laws against occupation, against colonization, and so forth. But
it's just a political trope, man. The Chinese don't care about the Palestinians or anything. That's just their buddies are the Iranians and the Russians, and they're on whatever side those guys are on. They don't care about.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's to gain favor. The reason they do that is to gain support from the Arab and Muslim countries, and then to ensure that they don't speak out against what's happening in East Turkestan, and it's been largely successful in that sense. So we need to, the international community needs to apply the same principles when it comes to East Turkestan. These are the things that governments can do. In the meantime, as individuals, just learning more about this, highlighting this issue, on social media, even one post, a month highlighting that, this genocide is still happening, that the world is forgetting about, is an important contribution. And of course, there are opportunities for, anyone's who wants to volunteer or, intern with us.
Oh, really? So what, for university students?
Yeah, for internships for university students, and then, anyone else who wants to volunteer, whether that's in research, advocacy, even like creating, social media and etc.
Cool, man. I'll put all the links that you want in the episode description. I hope people find out more about this through those links and volunteer if they, a little bit of time, money couldn't hurt. I mean, thank you so much for your time, and this is a crazy responsibility to have for someone so young, You're my age roughly. I don't think I've ever, carried the burden of the survival of a nation or anything like that,
I mean, it's not just about my own survival. I mean, yeah, I could be like anyone. I could just forget, and just focus on, living a happy life, you could say, in the West. But the issue is, it's not just about me. It's about my children's future, my relatives. I have, other than my immediate family members, all of my relatives, majority of them are in East Turkestan. I'm watching them, I know several of them have been killed. Over 100 had been taken into the concentration camps. We don't know about their whereabouts. All we know is that 4 were killed. And again, this was in response to my advocacy that they stated repeatedly, tried to pressure me to stop, they meaning the Chinese. When I refused, I mean, they started, going after, our relatives that were in the camps and prisons. And honestly, if I were to be like, all right, you know what, I'll keep my mouth shut, I'll stop what I'm doing, just let my relatives go, they're not going to let them go. They're not going to let them go. That's a fact. If they don't kill him today, they're going to kill him eventually, in like months, years. Furthermore, I'm not willing to destroy the future of 40 plus million people for my own, couple of relatives, or even 100 over, or even 1,000. I mean, we have to sacrifice everything to, ensure the future of our nation. Even looking at my children, for example, if I grow up, if we continue to forever live in exile in the United States, the likelihood of us being able to maintain our culture, our identity, is very slim. I'm a first generation, right? Growing up in the US. I know others in my community who were here. There were second generations. They've dissolved or assimilated, into the melting pot. If this continues, like I married a Uyghur woman, specifically because I want to preserve our identity. And that's my contribution. The very least thing that I can do is continue preserving our identity by marrying another Uyghur woman, having kids, and raising them as Uyghurs. But I have to come to the realization of the fact that if this exile is prolonged and if our people are destroyed in East Turkestan, there's no way we can preserve our identity here. My children will end up marrying, God knows who. If we stay here, they'll end up marrying, a Mexican or something, Arab, Latino, etc. Anyone from the various part, like the various mixing pot that the U.S. is. At the end of the day, my grandchildren are going to be like, oh, my grandfather was something called a Uyghur, and that's going to be it. That's where it finishes.
Oh yeah, that's crazy, and that's something I forgot to ask. That in fact the Chinese are pressuring you, and they're using your remaining relatives as hostages over there. Any help from the American government with that? Because you're an American citizen, and it's definitely a crime for a foreign power to extort you.
I mean, other than, they're slowly starting to address transnational repression, but they haven't been able to do anything to actually help those interned in the camps or the prisons. That's another sad reality. Again, this is why I say, many people argue, oh, well, you should just focus on advocating for better human rights conditions. Who's going to guarantee that? America's not going to guarantee that. America's not unwilling to even help save one Uyghur, let alone guarantee the human rights of millions. You think China, that is committing human rights atrocities against its own people, is going to grant human rights to a nation that they're trying to, for the past 100 years, that they've been trying to eliminate? No. For us, the only guarantee is by having our own sovereign state. Nobody's talking about our issue. Nobody's uttering, in Uyghurs. Nobody's highlighting our issue anywhere. We can't even get proper access to the UN to be able to talk about our issue because nobody cares if you're not a state. That's the sad reality of geopolitics today. Nobody gives a shit. I apologize for my language.
Don't. Here you don't have to. I'm shocked you made it this far without swearing. I didn't. Hey, well, man, thank you. And again, like this is a crazy issue, and your story is, I feel like it's really admirable that you've taken this on, and at great personal risk to you and your family as well. And I don't know, I'll at least do my part, and when I have dinner parties with so-called intelligent people, maybe bring some of this up. I guess that's where it starts.
Yep. I mean, just keeping the issue alive, talking about it, and trying to do anything we can, even if it's, simply sharing some information about it, saying, I oppose this, is helpful and impactful. It might not make an immediate impact, but it'll build up. And hopefully the world will act. Even, if the world did its most basic thing, this is what I'm saying. Like, if the world did the most basic thing, like another way we could be free and independent is if the world actually upheld international law. If the world actually pressured China, like in the case of of other countries, actually applied primary and secondary sanctions against those that are engaged in genocide and colonialism. If they actually upheld decolonization and pushed for our decolonization through international law, like how they did in South Africa with the apartheid, boycotting businesses and so forth. I mean, China is enslaving our people. They're engaged. They have, you could say, an apartheid regime in East Turkestan as well. If all of these happened, it would build up to where that pressure would, compel the Chinese to be like, all right, either we're going to destroy our own economy, our own people, our own country by keeping on to this territory. Because in the 1970s, many Chinese leaders, they're like, why are we, this is a waste of time. There were a lot of Chinese leaders who felt that, that they should just let go of East Turkestan. And I'm sure, if there's financial and economic costs and reputational costs, not that the Chinese Communist Party cares about its reputation, but you know what I mean, like diplomatic and other costs, from the international community, it might be compelled. And that, I think that would be, an ideal solution. Probably not the most realistic solution, but it would be the ideal solution. It would be a solution that wouldn't involve, further suffering of anyone.
Yeah. Whew. Yeah. All right, man. Hey, thank you. It was awesome to meet you as well. Thank you, and I'll try to pronounce it now. Your name is Salih Hudayar. Yeah, close. And they're called the Uyghurs. No?
Yep.
Oh
Perfect.
my God, I'm a genius. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much, man.
I have to say you're better than 99% of people who try to pronounce it.
99% of people don't care, so I think that's why.
Thank you again.